Thanks for coming, everybody. My name is Bob Pasnow. I'm a professor in the philosophy department here at CU, and I'm the director of the Center for Western Civilization, Thought, and Policy. Many thanks to coming to what is the last event that we're holding this semester, and it's a particular pleasure to be able to do it in conjunction with St. Aidan's Episcopal Church. We've collaborated with them before on events, and it's always a pleasure to be involved with what they're up to. Tonight's event is, of course, entitled Last Moments, Death and Our Animal Companions. And the plan is to talk here for around 90 minutes until about 7:30, at which point you'll all be invited over to St. Aidan's, which is just down the road and across Colorado Avenue, where we'll have a reception and there'll be an opportunity to look at the photographs that are the inspiration for tonight's event. If you haven't had a chance to see them, they're nicely mounted in a gallery there. If you don't know where St. Aidan's is, there's a map on the table outside. Our panelists, each of our four panelists will speak for around 15 minutes each, and then the floor will be open for your own thoughts and any questions you might have for the panelists. Let me now introduce them. I'll introduce them from your left to right, which is not by coincidence the order in which they'll be speaking. We've got this totally orchestrated. Beginning with Dr. Cheryl Abate. She's a newly minted PhD from right here in CU Boulder's philosophy department. She'll be taking up a tenure track position this fall at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Her dissertation is on animal rights, and she already has a very, very long list of publications in this area, enough that probably she can go up for tenure like next year or something like that. It's really quite an extraordinary resume already. To Cheryl's left is Father Dan Edwards. He comes from Texas, and his undergraduate and law degree are both from the University of Texas. He practiced law for some time here in Colorado, then in Idaho. He then returned to school and received a divinity degree, studied at Harvard Divinity School and Columbia Theological Seminary, among other places. Ultimately, he then went on to serve for 17 years as a parish priest in Macon, Georgia. After that, he was the Bishop of Nevada for a decade in the Episcopal Church, before retiring to Colorado last year, but I gather he hasn't really retired and that he's now serving at St. Aidan's, taking over during the sabbatical of Rector Mary Kate Rejui for some part of this year. Okay, to his left is Dr. Jessica Pierce, who once upon a time, as she just reminded me, taught here at CU Boulder, but she's now a faculty affiliate at the Center for Bioethics, Ethics and Humanities at CU's Anschutz Medical Campus. She's published a whole lot of things in high-profile places. She's published essays in the New York Times, in the Wall Street Journal, in The Guardian, in Psychology Today, where she has a regularly appearing thing. She's the author of 10 books, or is it 11 now? 10, just 10, including, just to give you an idea, a book entitled The Last Walk, Reflections on Our Pets at the End of Their Lives. Another book entitled Run, Spot, Run, The Ethics of Keeping Pets. She's got a brand new book out, co-authored with Mark Beckhoff, a professor whose name, you might recognize him, was a longtime professor here. The new book's entitled Unleashing Your Dog, How to Give Your Canine Companion the Best Life Possible. Finally, and really the reason we're all here is Professor Ross Taylor, who's an assistant professor of journalism here at CU Boulder. Ross is a longtime friend of the center. He was a former faculty fellow of the center. We've organized previous events around photography with him. Ross is relatively new to the CU campus, but he has a distinguished career as a photojournalist, having won national and international awards, including Photojournalist of the Year by the National Press Photographers Association. His work in a trauma hospital in Afghanistan was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, and when he was a fellow at the center, it brought all of the fellows of the center to tears listening to him give a presentation on this work a year or two ago. Okay, well, without further ado, let me hand things over to Cheryl, and she can give her remarks on this topic.
Okay, so I'm going to be giving some remarks from sort of the intersection of ethics and legal philosophy. So these are, I haven't ever published on this particular topic before, so these are some, thoughts and ethical and legal questions that I have and I think would be helpful for us to consider as we think about these issues. So I'm just going to refer to sort of the notes that I put together. Okay, so there's a widespread belief that, as animal ethicist Bernard Rollin from Colorado State University says, animals live overwhelmingly in the present. So unlike humans, animals can't reason their way out of their suffering. Humans, like you and I who suffer, can anticipate the future and hope for a better future, a cure, or relief for our suffering. We, moreover, can look forward to fulfilling our future-oriented desires or plans, and oftentimes this can, to some degree, alleviate our suffering. But it's unlikely that our animal companions have what we might call cognitive relief from suffering. So when the nows of our animal companions are, or will soon be, filled with unrelenting acute suffering, the humane, compassionate, and just thing to do is to permanently end the animal suffering through non-voluntary euthanasia. But this is easier said than done. Surely we shouldn't wait until our animals have reached this state of unrelenting acute suffering to euthanize them. So the most pressing question then isn't should we euthanize our suffering companions? Rather, the question is when should we euthanize our suffering companions? So veterinarian Dr. Jennifer Quartz advises, quote, better a week too early than an hour too late, end quote. She says that in her 12 years of veterinary practice, she has never had a single animal guardian tell her that they wish that they had waited longer to euthanize their animal. But countless people have told her that they wish that they would have stepped in sooner. Currently, veterinarians don't get to decide when to euthanize the suffering of owned animals who visit their clinics. Only animal guardians can make this decision. And if some guardians wait too long, this is certainly of moral concern, and it should be of legal concern too. So right now, there are state anti-cruelty laws which generally protect companion animals from first, the intentional infliction of pain and suffering, and second, neglect, such as the deprivation of food, water, shelter, and medical care from their non-human companions. I think that there's a sense in which those who wait too long to euthanize are guilty of neglecting their animal companions and depriving them of what they need to be free from suffering. So from a socio-ethical perspective, it is concerning that anti-cruelty laws haven't been adequately extended to the issue of animal euthanasia. So right now, there are some state laws that regulate end-of-life care of companion animals. So there are, for instance, laws that stipulate who can euthanize and what methods of euthanasia can be used. Several states have enacted laws on emergency euthanasia. So in those states, designated persons may euthanize animals in what they call emergency situations if the animals are deemed to be injured or sick beyond treatment. But within these states that have these laws, in most cases, the owner must be considered as unavailable before the animal can be euthanized. So if guardians are available and they insist that the animal should not be euthanized, they are well within their rights to do so. After all, there aren't laws that require guardians to euthanize their terminally ill, suffering animals. So perhaps, though, legally speaking, veterinarians ought to be the ones to decide when suffering animals should be euthanized. Ultimately, I think that this would benefit, first, veterinarians, second, animal guardians, and third, most importantly, animals themselves. So here are just some thoughts to motivate this suggestion. So some studies show that 1 in 6 veterinarians have considered suicide. And no doubt, much of this mental anguish that veterinarians endure is related to the fact that they currently must allow suffering animals to return home, only to suffer more when their guardians refuse to euthanize. Moreover, there's no doubt that when guardians are forced to make the decision or the choice to kill their animal companions, they're going to suffer terribly. So even if animal guardians make the right decision about euthanizing their non-human companions, it's inevitable that they're going to feel an overwhelming sense of guilt or that they've betrayed their animals in some sense. So if we take sort of the decision out of their hands, that may alleviate these really serious concerns. And surely most guardians who refuse to euthanize their suffering animals, they don't do so because they're malicious. They might do so because they have an irrational hope that their animal companions will miraculously be cured. They might do so because they're in denial. And sadly, helpless animals are the ones who endure the ultimate price, right?
Thank you. Thank you. I want to talk about the decision to euthanize or not euthanize as a moral choice. In philosophy, a moral choice means a decision you make to do or not do something that has consequences not only for yourself, but also for others. And moral choices are regulated by the field known as ethics or moral philosophy. And I want to approach this from the standpoint of a particular philosopher, Martha Nussbaum, who writes about tragic choices. There are many situations, many ethical decisions we make in which you can really reason your way through, based on various principles, to which decision, what is actually the right thing to do here. But there are also situations, she says, where we live in a web of obligations, a network of relationships made up of obligations in which it's really impossible to fill them all. And when we have decisions to make that are deeply painful and very hard decisions, sometimes that's because they are within the realm of what Nussbaum calls a tragic choice, and that means there isn't really a clear right or wrong answer. And when that is the situation, you don't have a rule that will answer the question for you. So what do? She says that there are certain qualities of character, we call them virtues, certain qualities of character that are to be exercised in those situations. And if we exercise those qualities of character while making the tragic choice, then at least we can grow in ourselves through the process, and hopefully others who are involved in this whole event can grow together too. So I want to suggest that in the context of pet euthanasia, there are three key virtues or qualities of character that I want to consider. And the first is compassion. Is compassion at play here? Compassion as opposed to convenience or expense, those sorts of things, actual caring. And I'm going to call that a moral virtue because from my worldview, compassion is the meeting point, the nexus between our experience and that which is eternally valuable. So compassion, first priority. Second, though, is awareness. Sometimes we make our decisions, we anesthetize a part of our consciousness so that we choose not to think, choose to deny, choose not to be aware of potential consequences of our action. And I want to say that that leads to a decision that is false. And so, first, compassion. Second, genuine awareness. And the third is authenticity. And that is actually telling the truth to yourself and to others about why you're doing what you're doing. So, compassion, awareness, and authenticity. I have been with a lot of families at the end of their pets' lives. I have done innumerable pet funerals. I've provided pastoral care and support to grieving pet owners in all sorts of situations and ages. And I got to tell you, in terms of compassion, I just always find it there. I always find people being genuinely and truly compassionate. Awareness, sometimes that's a little harder to judge, and I don't know that I could really assess that in others. And authenticity, are they really being straight about why they've made the decision they've made? That's hard to call too. And since I wouldn't attempt to call that on somebody else, and I can't even call it on myself, I will just outline a story of a pet I had and my going through this process and wondering about my compassion, wondering about my authenticity, my awareness, and wondering about my authenticity. Quite a few years ago, my family got a puppy. It was a Mastiff puppy, not the bull Mastiff, but the really big Mastiff. This was going to be a 175-pound bruiser. I was probably buying him, getting such a dog in order to compensate for something, I guess. I don't know. But the thing with Mastiffs is because they are so powerful, they are bred to be gentle, which is a good thing. But the problem is if you overbreed for gentle, you get fearful and anxious, and anxiety manifest as aggression. And so early on, our dog turned out to be dangerous. And this is a big, dangerous dog. And I thought, the responsible thing here to do is to put this dog down. But there are a couple of things going against that. One is that we all really deeply loved him. And the second is that I regarded him not as a higher functioning frontal lobe thing, but as a sentient being. And I had spent a good deal of time as a Buddhist, and so had learned a certain regard for sentient beings and the sense that all sentient beings are evolving. And my thought was, he is here to evolve, and I am not going to aid his evolution by killing him. But what I can do is keep him away from people. And so for 8 years, not 9 years, it was really a stress, a burden, and a great difficulty to keep him isolated from everybody except the family. And we cared for him and loved him and did everything we could to bring him along. Did he come along? I don't know. Was that whole thing about sentient beings true or not? I don't know. But that's what I told myself. That was the thinking. But was I aware, or was I just trying to save myself from the pain of making that decision? Hard to judge. Years went by. No one got hurt. We were very careful. And he developed congestive heart failure, which became progressively debilitating. And it finally became seriously debilitating to the point that he could only stagger around. And we called a vet friend to come to our house, because you couldn't take this dog to a vet. But this friend came to our house, and I was asking him to put the dog down because I thought he was not in pain. Pain might have shifted it, but he was not in pain. But he was becoming so pitifully helpless. And the vet, really to my surprise, said, no, let's wait. Let's give it some time. And he didn't explain that decision. I don't know what that was about. I don't know whether it was that he thought there was something more to process for the dog, or I don't know whether he thought that our family needed more time to process it. I don't know what he was thinking. But it was less than a week later when the dog was no longer able to stand. He couldn't control his bodily functions, and his breathing was very, very labored. He seemed desperate and afraid because of the inability to breathe. And that's when the vet came and administered the shot and ended his life. And I've lost many family members over whom I have grieved longer, but I never lost a family member over whom I grieved harder than that. So my decisions in that, I think they're all questionable. I don't know that I did wrong, but I am not the least bit confident that I did the right thing at any step. So how does one live with that moral ambiguity and doubt?
Okay, I'm not sure. I live with it too. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here. And I apologize in advance for my voice, which sounds really scratchy and froggy. I'm just on the tail end of a cold, so hopefully you can understand what I'm saying. So the experience of ushering a companion animal through the final moments of life and of orchestrating and managing the death of a best friend is profoundly moving and deeply traumatizing for the human companions of these animals and for the veterinary professionals attending to the animals and people in these intimate moments. Yet this experience remains largely invisible. Ross's images, which some of you may have seen or will see if you're able to look, offer us a window into this intimate space. Capturing these moments on film has the potential to tell us a great deal about people, animals, and death, and can perhaps initiate conversation about this ethically significant practice. So Ross and I met last fall when he contacted me about a documentary he was making on in-home euthanasia. I've been thinking about animal end-of-life care for many years, inspired by my experiences with the decline and death of my own dog, Odysseus. Now, admittedly, animal death is not a typical area of research for somebody in the field of medical ethics. So just a quick word on how I ended up there. It's really Odie's fault. And I'm sorry, I wish I had known that we could use slides because I would have brought a picture of Odie. He was a beautiful dog. So about 10 years ago, I was in the process of laboring over a textbook in contemporary bioethics. And really the bread and butter of this field is ethical issues in death and dying. These are the questions that really historically motivated the field in the 1960s and really have sustained it since then. So I was laboring professionally over questions like, when, if ever, is it appropriate to hasten the death of a patient who is experiencing unrelenting suffering? How do we make decisions about medical care, particularly end-of-life care, for people who cannot speak for themselves? How do we weigh quality of life against sanctity of life? So in the background of my professional work on this book, and always interjecting itself both emotionally and also practically, was the decline and really painful deterioration of my beloved friend Odie. And I realized over time that the issues I was struggling with in this bioethics text were exactly the same issues I was struggling with Odie. And the ethical terrain is every bit as complex, rich, and significant in the realm of animals as it is in the realm of human care. So that led me to research and write my book, The Last Walk, which explores not only euthanasia, but also pain relief, palliative care, and animal hospice. So it was that book that sort of willy-nilly connected me to Ross, or Ross to me. He found my book, and we got together to talk about his documentary, and got to talking and talking and talking, and realized how much we had to talk about, and ultimately decided to collaborate on a book chapter, which was about specifically the practice of in-home euthanasia of animals, and really taking as our point of interest and departure the intersection of our two very different fields of photojournalism and bioethics. Turned out to be a really interesting project. And I'm going to give you just a couple of highlights from that work and then end with a couple of questions that I would like to see somebody, me or somebody else, think about in the future. So the first point that, and it may seem obvious, but I'm not sure it is that this is not an insignificant issue. So, you know, nobody keeps track of how many animals die every year and the conditions under which they die. But doing some very rough but educated guesswork with help from people like Kathy Cooney, who's in the audience here, and it's a wonderful resource for all things related to animal hospice and in-home euthanasia. What I have come up with is that approximately 5 million animals, companion animals in the United States, are euthanized each year. And I'm talking about euthanized in the context of end-of-life care or relief of suffering. This is a totally separate issue and totally separate calculation from euthanasia taking place in shelters for other reasons. So of those 5 million animals, roughly maybe a fifth, so about 1 million animals and their families are choosing in-home mobile euthanasia. That's a lot of people and a lot of animals going through this experience. Secondly, and perhaps not surprisingly, the social and ethical ramifications run really deep. And Ross's work explores a lot of his past work, as he'll probably tell you, is about sites of trauma. And I find it really interesting that he has identified in-home euthanasia as a site of trauma. So that tells you something about it. That this would be, you know, somebody who does work on burn units and Afghanistan war experience is also looking at the experience of people losing an animal in the home. So from what we can gather from the very sparse, still psychological literature, the euthanizing of a companion animal can be a point of significant trauma for pet owners and for veterinary professionals alike. More people report experiencing profound, and you mentioned this, Dan, protracted grief after the death of an animal, and often describe this loss as more painful than the loss of a human loved one. Companion animal euthanasias can evoke feelings not only of anguish and grief, but also deep ambivalence, guilt, and personal responsibility. These intense experiences are often socially isolating because grieving for animals is not widely understood, nor is it culturally accepted as appropriate. So we have a lot of questions to answer. We have a lot more questions than we do answers in the realm of animal euthanasia. So far, it hasn't been a hot topic of research. Hopefully that'll change sometime in the future. So I want to close by mentioning a couple of questions that I have and some challenges for Ross. So I think that the home as a site of loss is very interesting, both because of the increased comfort and intimacy of the environment as opposed to, say, a veterinary clinic, and also because of the potential for isolation and social withdrawal that can go along with the home environment. Some questions we cannot answer yet. Does the experience of having an animal die within the home setting rather than at a clinic make a difference in how people experience the loss? Are people less traumatized after a euthanasia that takes place in the home as opposed to the clinic, or not, and why? And how do animals experience their own passing in one setting versus the other? On this second question of how animals might experience their own passing, there's reasons to think that the home would be better for the animal. For example, animals for whom euthanasia is initiated are often ill or extremely aged, and being moved into a car and into a veterinary clinic can be physically uncomfortable. It can also be emotionally uncomfortable. A lot of animals don't particularly like the vet and feel fear in that setting. Home is more emotionally comfortable for them, in which case, is there a moral imperative to make in-home euthanasia more broadly available and more affordable? As for people, we can again presume that in-home euthanasia offers some advantages. If the animal is more comfortable, the people caring for that animal may be less anxious about how their animal is feeling and what they are experiencing. Death can proceed more organically in a less rushed manner and kind of along its own timeline. It's a quiet environment. It tends to be more peaceful. I'm sure that's not always the case. And there's more opportunity for family members to ritualize, to pray, to light candles, to do things that they might feel uncomfortable doing in a veterinary clinic setting. And perhaps most importantly for the people involved, grieving can take place in a sphere that is safe and private. It may not be easy for everyone to just feel that they can let loose in a veterinary clinic. And one thing an experience I'll never forget is sitting in a veterinary office with my very young, healthy dog at the time, and this couple came in. The man was carrying a black lab who was clearly there to be euthanized. Their tears streaming down their faces. They carried this dog back into the back. About 20 minutes later, I was still waiting in the waiting room. They emerged back out again, just tears streaming down their faces, looking just anguished, and I felt the whole situation made me feel really sad for everyone involved, veterinarian, animal, and family. So if we can create a space that is different from that, less public and more sort of accepting of the grieving process that needs to take place, I think it would be a benefit for everyone. And then I promised a few more challenging questions coming from, this is the ethicist in me. So euthanasia is an area of human-animal interaction that has remained behind a seawall of privacy, and part of the reason for that, I think, is that it is an intimate act of compassionate care and violence. We may think of care and violence as mutually exclusive, but in fact, they are often tangled together. And the care of animals who are ill, aged, or dying is one of the places in which this entanglement is often present. Medical anthropologists have explored the concept of violent care, and in relation to the choice to euthanize an animal, we might understand this as an act of caring that relieves suffering through an act of violence, through bringing about death. And then one of the most interesting aspects of Ross's work to me is the fact that it makes me really uncomfortable. And I've thought about why it makes me uncomfortable, and there are some obvious reasons. It's hard to watch people in this much pain. And the pain that they're experiencing, if you haven't seen the pictures and you look at them, you'll see it. It's hard to look at. But are there other reasons it makes me uncomfortable? And I think, yes, there are. One of the things that makes me uncomfortable is the fact that these images are about the human drama. And in a sense, the animal is both present yet also invisible. In funny ways, the animals are almost a prop for what we see happening in the human realm. And I know that the pictures are not meant to be about the animals, but it's one thing that as somebody who thinks about animal ethics all the time, we already have a problem of animal suffering being invisible. So is this a way in which we are reinforcing that invisibility? And what would it look like if these pictures centered around the animals instead? I don't know. Maybe that's your next project. You're like, what the hell are you talking about? And then another, and you'll probably think I'm a crackpot even for bringing this up, but I do think this is interesting too. Is it ethical for us to make the death of an animal patient open to public viewing? This came up in very sharp relief in relation to humans, particularly, I don't know if some of you may be old enough to remember this and some maybe not. In 1998, Jack Kevorkian was shown on CBS 60 Minutes, actually ending the life of the patient Thomas Yoke. And a lot of people were very disturbed by, not only by the imagery, but also by the fact that 60 Minutes was willing to air this and accused the media of crossing a line or crossing a boundary. So that's a question I have here is, are we crossing a boundary by putting animal death on public display? There's some easy questions for you. And I can tease you, I know, because you know it's all in the spirit of, I love your work. So, thank you.
I wanted to thank Bob for having this, and it's been an honor being a part of the center before and just a part of the community. And I definitely want to thank Jessica. My relationship with Jessica has made my work more nuanced and made my understanding of the work to give a different context. And I'll just begin by saying I by no means state that I have answers of totality of an idea. It's nice to see Kathy out there. I think I've had an interaction, so it's nice to meet you too. I appreciate the panelists and those in the crowd for coming too. This is not the lightest of topics, and as somebody who's borne witness to a lot of cases, I can easily say that I can easily say that it's been some of the more difficult things that I've ever documented, and some of what I'm expressing too is that I'm also working on a feature-length film on the topic. So my whole world the past 6 months has been immersed in this type of media. So I also sorry, I didn't expect this to happen. My life has just been profoundly influenced by it. A couple of things that, as far as the ethical questions that raise, I certainly welcome them. I do want to be clear that I only have thoughts about what I've witnessed, and I can speak to reasons for publication, but definitely would welcome any both criticisms or thoughts or ideas about media. I think once media is published, I don't have opposition for discussion, and part of it a lot of my work historically has, I wouldn't have known this as a younger person, and it's probably lack of maturity, and I think aging has helped crystallize this idea. But I kept circling over issues related to trauma in my career without necessarily knowing that, but gravitating towards it. So much of my work involves loosely the issues that are present within the work. I've covered the death process of a person. I was present at their death and documented their death, and we published that. And we certainly wrestle with some of these same discussions about whether or not it would be appropriate, the context of that. I've documented, I would never describe myself as a war photographer, but I have photographed conflict and war, and have photographed in trauma hospital in Afghanistan, and we wrestle with some of these very same questions. I've worked in a burn unit and wrestled with very similar issues of documentation of even a person who set themselves on fire and documented them. And I keep coming back to this, though, and I one of the things that I feel very confident about in the notion that while some of the work may distill or may generate a discussion that's nuanced and has some concerns or uncomfortable nature with it, at the same time, I am a firm believer that people who are undergoing traumatic events or spaces of trauma, when they see themselves in those spaces and they see other people experiencing, one of the takeaways for sure is that people feel less alone. And the more I do that, the more I believe in this. And I'm happy to show some of the work, and I'll certainly, there may be some in the audience who may not want to see it, and I respect that for sure. Some of you, I would assume, have gone through this recently, and I want to be cognizant of that. But I can tell you that when I published this project, when I was working on it, I thought myself, I wasn't sure who would see this. Very, very briefly, I always want people to understand my origin story. I like to tell people, you mentioned, why are we doing what we're doing? I'm not the smartest person. I deal in academia all the time, and I see some very bright people, but I think one thing that I'm very strong at, and that I'm vigilant about, is about understanding my purpose and thinking about it before engaging in the documentary form. And I was dating a woman at the time who was going through this, and I don't know if I was the best partner for her at that time while she was going through this. I think I was a fine partner, but I watched her go through this, and that's my origin story, was seeing her go through this painful process and seeing it at home. And when I began to search media, I didn't see much representation on it. So that's where I started, and I think, if I don't want to go into too much of a tangent, but I think anybody who does documentary work, if you're really to mine the psychology of that person, I think they're trying to work through issues within themselves and resolve things. And for me, that was my origin, was trying to better understand. And that's why I started. I wanted to better understand and have a better understanding of what people were going through. So it began this I had no idea how much this would just shape my life. So for 2 years, I've been working with this topic through both a documentary film and a photographic project. The photographic project is published, and when I tried to publish it, I didn't think it would, I wasn't even sure if anybody would want to see it because of issues that you raise, and I certainly had my own concerns and wasn't sure, but it got published in the Washington Post, and then I've never had anything really go viral, and it just went immediately everywhere. I had requests from across the world and multiple continents. In 1 week in BuzzFeed, it had 1.5 million views. We've easily could guess that multiple millions of views. And that really surprised me because I didn't think that people would want to see that type of work. And I don't know if want is the right word, because I don't know if it's something we necessarily want to see. But I think there's something that happened in the connection and the thread. My inbox overflowed, and I've never had this. People shared their diary entries. Random strangers shared stories of their pets. They would share pictures in the most heartbreaking of ways. And I mean, I would say hundreds of people reached out to me, hundreds. And that's when I thought, okay, there's some integrity for this. There's a reason for this. And it touched some people in a very poignant way. And so I'm happy to show some of the work, but just anybody who wants to step out, I'm happy to just give you a glimpse of some of the work. And I'm almost done with the feature-length film, which is really about the human-animal bond and the final moments. We are together, and we should be done by the end of May, and then we'll start to think about distribution. But distribution will also be in context of how we put out this material, and what proper context and what's ethically sound or as sound as possible. So it's something that I will think a lot about before I put the work out there. So I'd always want to make sure that the work has proper context and has a place. And I really appreciate the discussion here. I think it's one that my life has been changed. Whenever I see somebody who's going through this, I now look at them right in the eye, and I see it differently. And it's through this type of environment, the work that you do, Kathy, every day, and the work that you explore. My respect and gratitude for those who work in this field has bloomed beyond my own, whatever I could have ever thought. And any of you going through this or recently gone through it, you have my sympathy, and for, at least in a small way, I have a greater respect for what you've gone through. So with that, I'm happy to show work if you would like, and if anybody would like to step out, I want to be very cognizant of triggering anybody of the work. And just a warning that the work is, it's intense. So I've explored, and the premise of the work is to focus on the final minutes that somebody shares with their animal. And it's, the parameters are the 5 minutes before the loss of a pet, and then 5 minutes after. So those of you who would like to step out, it'll take about 5 minutes if you want to take a break. I won't show any of the film. I want to be really careful. You're just meeting me, and I feel like sometimes I have this effect with the type of work that I do when I show work. I feel like I'm like Jon Snow in Game of Thrones, where it's just like always sad and dark. But and I try to be a little prefacing in the sense of what you'll be about to see. When I began this work, it was apparent to me immediately of the intensity of this. I remember calling my friends and thinking, just telling people, you can't imagine what I'm seeing and bearing witness to. And I just kept feeling more and more drawn to it, more intense. So I'll just quickly show some of the work. Just again, very quickly, a lot of the work is pretty intense, and so just to give you context. But it's the final 5 minutes before or 5 minutes after the moment. And I've kept a wider selection because I want people to have an understanding of the sense of the space of the room and the environment in which it happens. Every person that you see in a frame has granted permission. I would never photograph, I would never be in a space without the permission of somebody. Why are you doing what you're doing is a central point. I had a woman who was losing her cat, and I had previously explained, and she'd granted permission. But as she looked up at me with tears in her eyes, and I'm only a couple of feet from her, she said, why are you doing this? And we had already talked about this, but if I had not spent a great deal of time thinking about this and bringing honoring and respect to that space, I wouldn't have been able to answer that appropriately. And that's a question that I need to be able to answer to people when I'm in their space. The images, I think, you've astutely pointed out that that they are, that they're sites of trauma. They're some of the most So there's some of the most raw moments, that I've ever witnessed. And I've seen conflict up close. I've seen somebody's head blown off. I've seen limbs. I've seen the cost of war. I've been in gun battles. I've taken refuge in when bullets are flying around. Not being hyperbolic, it doesn't happen every day. It only happened once. But I have been in some pretty hairy situations. And this matches anything that I've ever seen. So when somebody loses their pet, it sticks with me. And I think part of what I'm reacting to is I'm tired. I've been dealing with this for a long time. And I've been editing this film so I can still hear, I still hear this crying and the wailing of people. And it's been, I'm really sorry. I didn't think this would happen. I think it's taken a toll on me, for sure. But I'm I'm committed to this, and I'm committed to the respect, and I'm committed to the project, because I can still hear her screams. I can still remember that moment and that wail. It's that one moment that's so powerful when that bond is not broken or ended, because it continues on, but it is as intense as anything that I've ever experienced. And I've seen a lot. And I don't mean to be dramatic, but I've witnessed a lot. And the vets that deal with this on a daily basis, they have my respect. It is a profoundly intense situation. I'll just work through this. And I worked primarily with an organization in Florida called Lap of Love, who allowed me into their life. I've worked a little bit with an organization called Caring Pathways here in Denver, but the majority of the work is in Florida. One of the interesting things is a lot of the families will request to see all of the pictures. I never send pictures without first making sure that they want to see it. Part of my protocol is I always say, if you would like a portrait before, I will do that. And then I always email a family afterwards and say, are you ready? Would you like this? Some people then would say no, they may change their mind. I never would want to populate an inbox without it just happening. But people like him, he wanted to see the entire shoot. And so I sent him my entire shoot, and he was very grateful. And I get a whole host of this type of feelings. But I think there are people who want to see this of their own record. And I can't, some people won't, and some people will. I have no judgment either way. I can only honor if they want that, because they allow me into their home. But I'm still in touch with them. I'm still in touch with a number of these families. And I always, when these published, I made a real big effort to make sure that they had quotes. I wanted to make sure that the people gave agency and they had more context to the love. And I think that really helped a lot. When she was talking about how she loved him for so long, the dog's name is Dingo. And I think that was really appropriate to make sure that their words are heard. And it's been, I'm sorry, I know this is very intense, and so I appreciate you sticking with it. But, it hits all of us. This is a guy who was a diver and lives in a boat, and he's a very tough man, and this shattered him. And of all the people I documented, and the film opens with him, just watching him go through this. And this woman I'm still in touch with, she's a really lovely woman. She also wanted all the pictures and sent all the images to her. And I can still hear the thunder. It was raining and there was a thunderstorm outside. So these images also in me bring back immediate memories of the auditory around. And it was actually here where I decided to do the film. It was the auditory experience of the documentation and hearing what people said to their animals. I thought it was exceedingly moving, and I've never seen anything like it. And so the photographic portion was the first part, and then I returned to work on a film later. So I'm sorry for becoming so emotional. I didn't mean to. I think you're just catching me at the tail end of a very intense 6-month edit where I've just been, I'll be on the Flatirons Flyer sometimes and I'll be crying in my headphones and I'm in the corner in the back of the Flatiron Fly-ins because I'm editing on the way up, and I think it's really been a lot. So thank you so much for taking the time to see the photographs, and again, apologies for becoming emotional up here, but thank you, Bob, for the opportunity.
We give a hand to all of our speakers. So the floor is now open for questions, comments. Any thoughts anybody has? Yeah, go ahead. Let me bring the mic to people because we're recording this, and if you don't speak into the mic, you won't be on the recording.
Ross, you kept apologizing for your emotions. I was determined before coming here, if the images would be shown, I would walk out. Your emotions made it possible for me to stay here. When I first saw your pictures online, I was in my office, and I'm a grief counselor, and I had to reach for the box of Kleenex. I was convulsing in my office. Having you, who has been through the stories repeatedly, with an opportunity to become accustomed to those stories and the rawness of the stories and maybe build up some kind of fortitude, to see you experience such strong emotions really validated what I was experiencing and what I'm experiencing now. So thank you. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Eriko, and I lost one of my cattle dog last Thursday. So I had in-home euthanasia. It was beautiful. It was very comforting, and that was my second one. And when I was struggling, when was the time? All my friends are dog friends. And they said, "Oh, she will tell you." And I said, "What do you mean she will tell me? I'm not going to know when is the right time." But both times, the dog told me it's time. And that was very comforting to me, and that confirmed that I did the right thing. And another thing is that years ago, two of my cattle dogs were out in a yard. And one cattle dog, it was a freak accident, hit the tree and died instantly. Because over the fence, there are 4 poodles. And that's a freak accident. And Fly, the dog, was dying. And my dog, Paige, was, okay, he's gone. Let me keep on barking at those poodles. She didn't care. And I felt kind of, what's wrong with you? But I realized that's the way it is. The death is a part of life. And when the dog see the end, they understand. But one time, one of our dogs went to the vet, never came back. And 2 other dogs were looking for him. So it's very, I'm learning the meaning of death through my dogs. And the last week when I let Sunny go, we are very sad, but at the same time, I felt like I completed his life. So sad, but it was okay with me. It's just, it's sad, but there is another way of looking at things I just want to share with you.
I wonder if any of the panelists would like to comment on the question about dogs and other dogs recognizing death, those kinds of circumstances. Yeah, I thought you might, Jessica.
I think it's a really interesting question that, again, it's one of these things that we don't know that much about. Hasn't been a lot of research into animals' understanding of mortality and death, basically because people have assumed for centuries that animals aren't that smart or sentient, so they wouldn't be thinking about things like that, and that an awareness of death is the unique province of human beings. And we're learning that that's silly, like a lot of our other assumptions about our own uniqueness and specialness. We're not the only ones who use tools, etc. We're not the only ones who understand death. And I think your comments are interesting in a couple of different respects. One is the way animals react is all over the board, and some don't seem to notice or pay any attention. Although to that I would say, well, they may still know. They may be reacting in ways that we just don't see or don't perceive. And I, like Ross, after my book came out, and I thought this is a book nobody's going to read except my mother, I got flooded with emails from people who had been through this experience and were just so glad to have somebody talking about it. And I got a lot of stories about people's experiences of having other dogs or cats present. And a lot of them did report anecdotally that other animals present did respond to the death with grief or some other kind of reaction. When Odie passed away, I'm not sure I should use the language passed away, when we had him euthanized, our dog Maya, who was Odie's best friend and mother hen, was laying next to him on the couch, and she had her head on his back. And the instant he stopped breathing, she lifted her head and cocked it like, something's changed. And I thought that was really interesting. And our other dog, Topaz, was like running around like a crazy person, didn't seem to notice at all. So one of the things that I think is really nice about the in-home euthanasia experience is that other animals can be present and can know. And I think there is a difference, if an animal who is part of a family, an interspecies family, just disappears one day, there can be a sense of, looking for this companion or just sort of a door that hasn't been shut. And so I think that's another benefit of doing it in the home. And, sometimes people who do have a euthanasia in a clinic will bring the body home so that they can have a kind of wake for the other animals. And I think that's important too, to let them do what they need to do in their own way.
Okay, I thought I saw a question down here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. But you guys, what you're saying about the photos helping people know that they're not alone, that's the whole reason I came tonight. As you know, I put my cat down Saturday and picked up his ashes today. He was with me 19 years. He's at least 21 or 21. And I really am grateful for all of this. On the one hand, I know I'm not alone. On the one hand, I've heard all of the things that I've gone through. And I've done both. This was in home and euthanasia, and the last one was at CSU after he went back after having a recurrence of cancer. And I kind of knew what was going to happen, but was in denial. And he was a skittish, afraid cat that would come home from the vet with anorexia. And he had a horrible experience there. And I had so much guilt over that. And so this time, even though I was worried about doing it at home and always looking at that spot, there was no doubt I was going to do this one at home. And I tricked myself. He spent a lot of time under the guest bed when he was old and skinny near the vent, the heating vent. So I moved the guest bed, and I did it under the guest bed, and then I moved the bed back. So I think all over that all worked out. But I really appreciate this, and I wish it wasn't so taboo, or like I took photos and I had my friends take photos. As you guys said, people flood your mailboxes with this. I did that. I sent them to you a couple days ago. And when I decided to do that or started to do that or asked my friends, I felt a sense of strangeness and guilt. And is this right? And should I do this? And why am I doing this? And I'm a big Facebook share, but I haven't put them up there, and I don't think I'm going to. I just think I did it for me. And, I did put one picture up of my cat and I looking at each other in the eyes with the sun behind us, maybe 5 minutes before, but that was about it. But I'm glad I took them for me. So I'm glad I have them. And it's painful, but it's good to, feel like I'm not alone.
So this reminds me of something that you said earlier, Ross, that people don't want to see these photos, but there's, I think, a sense in which people need to see the photos, because I think the way that society looks at animals, right, we kind of view them as second-class citizens, as commodities. So when you do feel such intense grief over the loss of a companion animal, you almost feel like you're the crazy one for caring so much about a non-human animal. And I think that there's a sense in which what you're doing is really making animal lovers not feel alone, and to feel that what we feel is very much validated.
And I would also add that I think one of the most important functions of your work, and hopefully it won't just be animal lovers who see it, is that people who have friends or family who lose an animal, and they may not be animal people themselves, don't understand, but they are open to it. And, one of the most popular blogs I ever wrote was what to say or what to do when a friend loses a pet, which seems like kind of a silly topic, but people don't know. I mean, you send a sympathy card, you send flowers, you do the same things you would do if they had lost a loved one. And people so appreciate that, particularly from friends and family who don't have animals. So I think your work could do a huge service in just enlightening non-animal people, if we could call them that, to this world of experience that animal people have.
It's certainly changed my life.
Maybe I'll ask a question about children. I saw one of the cases that you photographed, Ross, featured a young boy in it, and I wondered about that case. And Dan, I wondered if you might have experiences with children losing pets, and what kind of observations you might have, either of you, about those kinds of cases.
I think from my limited experience, it can be the first, or it often is sometimes the first introduction or the visibility of death in a family. And so one of the cases in the film, not here, was a teenage girl coming home from college, and she had never experienced that process. And so I think, I don't know what to say other than I think that it's a powerful moment and the introduction of the mortality. And I think it's one that if people choose to do it at home, it should be very, very mindful and great and extraordinary care of that introduction if children are present. But y'all probably more.
Well, certainly for children, it's very hard, or usually it's especially hard. And since the person who is making the decision is generally the parent, then they have to be thinking about the suffering of their pet, and they also are thinking about the suffering of their child. That all becomes part of the mix. Just a word about part of why it may be especially hard for children from a psychological standpoint, and I always hate to talk in psychological terms about such a sensitive matter because it may seem to objectify the feelings, and I don't mean to objectify the feelings. I merely mean to appeal to the psychology in order to maybe understand it a little better. We love our pets for who they are. That is a given. But there can also be another piece of it. In object relations psychoanalysis, the analysts say that as we go through life transitions, there become parts of ourselves that we are uncomfortable with and we don't quite know how to relate to. And so what we do is unconsciously, imaginatively project that part of ourselves into something else. A child can do that with a doll or a plaything and so on, but especially pets. We often project parts of our own personalities into our pets. And so to lose the pet, well, what just happened to that whole part of yourself? You know, you feel as if maybe you've lost some of yourself, or maybe you're going to have to find some other way to deal with that part of yourself. And so that's why I think the euthanasia decision is hard for anybody making it, because their feelings about parts of themselves get tangled up in it. But because this process of projecting that part of yourself onto something else is what you especially do during transitional stages of life, and since that's what is so much what's going on for children, that means that children, more than adults, are going to have parts of themselves identified with their pet. And so that makes it a real challenge and requires a lot of sensitivity for the parents and friends.
Okay. Other questions, comments?
Everyone, this has been wonderful. I just want to put that out there right away. I am a veterinarian who has dedicated my life to euthanasia work and wanted to just speak to the point of children and other animals present, is how important it is that euthanasia goes well. Because if euthanasia doesn't go well, how complicating that is and crippling to the whole grieving process. So in my work, having children present has been a blessing, and giving them a chance to see death come in a very gentle way, a very meaningful way, so that when the death has been achieved, that there's a change in the room where they feel lighter sometimes. There's certainly times that they grieve very heavy, certainly, but also times where they feel lighter. There's a sense of relief, a shift in that room, and animals often pick up on that too. And I just wanted to share in particular with animals that one of my most common experiences is that when another animal is present for the death of a companion, that when I pronounce their companion deceased, there is a palpable shift in that room, and often the other animals go and lay down and take a nap, because it's been so intense building up to that moment, not only with themselves and what they're experiencing, watching their friend near the end of its life, but with the caregivers in the room. Okay, our energy as the humans around our animals so pick up on that. And that's been one of my most, I'll say, consistent patterns that I see with other animals present, is that. With also coming back a little bit to children here, is that I often have children want to be present for the death of their pet, and often it's the moms and the dads that say no. You know, they don't want them there, but it's really because they don't have great expectations or understanding of what's about to take place. And they themselves may have experienced a bad euthanasia, or what we call a dysphanesia, before, and they're trying to shield or protect their child from that. But when veterinarians perform euthanasia well, and again, gentle and slow, that the children get a very good death experience, and that shapes them going forward, where they'll be more likely to choose euthanasia for their own pet in the future if that's needed. So I love personally when children say to mom and dad, "But I want to be there," and then we allow them to do that. It's really wonderful.
I'm remembering back to times when people would take their animal to the vet, and there might be a bill of $200, and in that time it might just be, it seemed common to me that people would say, "I'm not going to spend that kind of money." Now we're seeing people spend more and more, and I don't know if could be both increased value of that animal in their life, maybe better economic times, I don't know. Talking about the disenfranchised grief, it was just my dog, it was just my cat, who am I to grieve, and so I keep it quiet. Are any of you seeing a trend, and you as well, Ms. Veterinarian, is anybody seeing a trend where people are starting to own their grief more without shame, speaking out about it and not hiding it so much?
I would say yes. Over the past 5 or 10 years, it has become more common and maybe also more acceptable for people to be open about it. And there have been some high-profile cases. Fiona Apple, musician, canceled her tour because her dog was dying, and she didn't want to not be there for her dog's death. And I think that was eye-opening for a lot of people, and also the reaction to it, which was, a few cranky people, but for the most part, this outpouring of support, and also a lot of publicity to an issue that wouldn't have gained that notoriety necessarily. To your point of whether people are spending more on their animals, I would say I'm not sure that's necessarily true. I think the people who spend on their animals are spending more. But there are plenty of people who are still not spending on their animals and who will buy a flat screen TV yet not pay for a $4 pain medicine to keep their arthritic dog comfortable. So there's still far too many people who aren't spending enough. And on the other hand, you could spend $20,000 doing stem cell therapy and et cetera, where you may just be sort of inflicting more suffering on your pet. So the amount of money spent isn't necessarily a accurate gauge of how much quality of life you're getting or how much love you are feeling. Kathy, do you know?
Yeah, so the cost of home euthanasia is usually triple, if not quadruple, what it is in the hospital setting. And more families across the country and the world now are willing to pay that. And they're willing to pay it because they're looking for a euthanasia experience. It is way more than just the giving of the injection these days. And if that's important to them, then they'll either save up for it, and it is possible that some will actually forgo medical treatment and not necessarily carry on palliative care longer just to make sure that they can afford that quintessential perfect death at home. And not only are they paying more than for home euthanasia, but they're often then paying more for the aftercare, the private cremation, the urns, the extra memorialization items to make sure that they are honoring the pet in the way that is important to them. Home euthanasia charges across the country, in case you are curious, I learn anywhere from $150 to $600 for home euthanasia, depending on the demographic. And that's, again, without cremation. Okay. So the experience of home euthanasia is often an hour of time, and veterinarians are leaving practice to go and to provide that with an hour travel time, sometimes their hour with the family. There are some home euthanasia services that are 3 hours in length, and that's what the doctor sections off in their day to be able to provide for the family. But for me, an hour-long euthanasia is the first 15 minutes is just building rapport, spending time, because a lot of home euthanasia providers have never met these families before. They've never met the pet before, and that's their opportunity to get involved and to learn. So about 15 minutes for building rapport. Then often we have, or most these days are providing what we call sedation or anesthesia before death itself to make sure that our pets are sleeping. And that takes about 15 minutes. And euthanasia itself is very quick, right? It's about a minute's time. So that entire hour is sometimes half an hour in preparation. And then that last half an hour is privacy, memorialization, talking, and often transitioning a pet out to the vehicle to help with aftercare. That's very normal. Or transitioning to a gravesite for burial. So it's a full-on experience, and that's why people are willing to spend that money, because it's a funeral. That is their pet's funeral for most.
My name is Lisa Nags, and I'm a seminary-educated dog trainer in the Denver area. I recently lost a dog, and when I wrote about her on Facebook and the last moments of her life and reflecting about that with her and with my family and what that experience was like, I was blown away by the responses of people on Facebook. And my dear friend here knows how much I lament and bitch and moan about social media, but I found myself so grateful. And I think that one of the things that has happened is that interspecies relationships are more normalized. People tell stories, and I had people that I hadn't seen for decades say, I never met Clementine, but she was one of my favorite dogs, and I knew her from the stories you told and the photos you shared. And that made me realize at 56, how grateful I am to have a less disenfranchised grief than in the past. When I was in 6th grade and my parents were divorcing, our very sensitive border collie at the time came up to me when I was crying on the back porch. And while I didn't see physical tears come down her face, I was absolutely certain that she was present and grieving with me. But I was long out of my undergraduate degree before I ever dared say that out loud to anyone, because I knew I would be deemed insane. And now we can talk about those things. And I know I'm rambling because these are disparate thoughts and thinking about things in an ethical situation that I don't often do, not being in an academic setting primarily. I wonder if some of the opportunities that we have for these in-home, end-of-life experiences aren't a sort of reclamation of knowing who we are in relationship to others, and like a time and of which I wasn't alive, so I can only speak from reading, but where medical option and opportunity didn't turn into medical imperative. So when people were asked, where would you like to die? They tended to die at home. And they were in a place of peacefulness and where death was a part of life, and regular ritual and specific ritual to goodbye and death, however the family understands it, was an opportunity to be shared in the community in which one lived, died, and dwelt. So just wonder if any of you want to speak to that.
I seem to always have something to say. But it's a profound point, and one thing that I would love to see melt away is the taboo that we seem to have about talking about animal death and human death in the same sentence, and taking what we can learn about letting go of our human family and companions from our experiences with animals, who in a way have it much easier. We let them die in a much more dignified way in some respects. And again, taking what we know and can learn from the human experience and applying that to our experiences with animals. So I'd love to see comparative work and conversation about that, and not being afraid that if you talk about an animal in the same sentence as a human, that you're somehow degrading the human, because it's not like that. It could be the other way around, in fact.
Yeah, having been given license to speak of human and animal in the same sentence, I have spent a considerable amount of time around human deaths. People in hospitals, often they were terminal, they were perhaps in comas or heavily sedated, and the doctors would keep saying, they should have died, several days ago, but they just keep not dying. And they would linger. And that's kind of an intense thing when, you've moved to that point where, okay, and I would often wonder what that was about. But something that I saw happen over and over and over during those lingering times was members of the family or their friends who were gathered there for the death, something shifted in them. Old grievances were resolved, insights were reached, and the people who were there for the death, they had to come to some sort of wholeness. And just as soon as they did, the person died. So I think that says something about what's going on around death for the family, the group, and that might inform how we go about doing animal death. It might suggest that perhaps the home euthanasia provides the opportunity for some really important psycho-spiritual stuff to go on for the people involved.
Okay, well, thank you all for your so interesting remarks, and I hope you're able to join us over at St. Aidan's, which is just a short walk away, for the reception. And let's thank our speakers one more time.